Okay. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to this event hosted by Clean Prosperity on what's next for conservative climate policy. I'm Michael Bernstein. I'm the Executive Director of Clean Prosperity, and we've got a great event for you today. We've got some terrific speakers, and we've got a wide array of participants too, from MPs' offices to political staff, members of the media, interested stakeholders. So welcome to everybody. It's really good to have you here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion. We are, of course, going to talk about conservative climate policy. We're going to look back at the most recent election and assess what role climate played in that election. And then we're going to ask our speakers to offer some friendly advice to the party on where they should go next on this file. And so here's how we're going to run the webinar. We're going to have Andrew Enns from Leger give a brief presentation on an exit poll that Clean Prosperity sponsored just following the recent federal election. We're then going to bring in a panel of longtime conservative thinkers, including Lisa Raitt, Ken Boessenkool, Mitch Davidson, and Louis Leger was supposed to join us, but unfortunately, I was told this morning that Louis is sick. It's not COVID, so no one needs to worry, but I think Louis might have bronchitis. So we hope you feel better, Louis. We're sorry you couldn't make it, but we'll get you next time. And then at the end of the panel, I'll bring Andrew Enns back into the conversation, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First of all, we are recording this webinar, and we'll be sharing it on our website and on social media and sending it out in our newsletter. So it's a good chance for me to plug that you should follow us on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter, and please stay in touch. You'll also notice, just like most webinars, we've muted microphones and stopped video for participants just to allow a smooth flow of the webinar. And I think that's really it. I think we can get started. So before I pass it over to Andrew, let me just provide a couple of very brief remarks on Clean Prosperity, who we are and why we organized this webinar. So as many of you will know, Clean Prosperity is an independent nonprofit. We advocate for climate policies that are also good for the economy. So we're really looking for solutions that reduce our emissions while increasing our competitiveness, and doing that all in a way that's affordable for everyday Canadians. Folks will know that we're big supporters of carbon pricing. We believe pricing should be a core part of any climate plan. But look, this is not really just about one policy. To us, decarbonization is about how we're going to zero out emissions from our economy over the next 3 decades. And if we're going to do that effectively, we're going to need all political parties to come to the table, to engage constructively, to offer their ideas, their vision of how we can do this. And I think it's particularly important for the Conservative Party to be at that table, not just because the Conservatives are obviously a leading party in our country and have historically formed government, but also because the party represents a wide swath of Canada and of Canadians, and particularly represents certain segments of the population who I think are at risk of possibly being of feeling left out or left behind as we move towards a lower carbon future. So I think it's critical that Conservatives are at the table representing those voices and offering their ideas. And ultimately, the goal really is to have the party develop policy that reduces emissions in a way that's good for the climate, but that does it in a way that's appropriate and acceptable for Canadians. And I think if they do that, that will be good for the Conservative Party as well. So that's really our motivation. That's why we wanted to host this conversation. And without further ado, I think I'll introduce Andrew Enns and get started with his presentation. So let me bring Andrew onto the screen, and then I will introduce him to everybody as well. So there's Andrew. Hi, Andrew. So Andrew is, and many folks might know Andrew, but Andrew's a well-known pollster and researcher. He's got more than a 20-year history in the polling industry, following 10 years in which he served in government in Ontario, in Manitoba, and also federally. He was a pollster for the Conservative Party during the Stephen Harper years, and he's now a trusted source of information for many leading politicians all around the country. Most of Andrew's time's been with NRG Research Group, but he is where he was a partner and president, but he now manages the Winnipeg office for Leger and participates in the company's national public affairs practice. So Andrew, it's great to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael, and really pleased to be part of your event. I'm going to share my screen and bring up a few slides that I want to be able to refer to as we get going. There we go. You guys can see that okay? I'm hopeful.
See it.
So we conducted Michael, as you mentioned, we conducted a large exit poll right after the election in 2021. We got into field September 21st, and we conducted 5,000 interviews between September 21st and September 28th. These were online interviews from our proprietary panel. We asked a large number of questions in terms of voting in the election, a number of questions around the ballot and your ballot choice, because we're able to from those questions build out sort of some important subgroups in terms of voting behavior, particularly important from a conservative support perspective, not only conservative voters, and understand how they responded to our survey, but also prospective conservative voters, accessible conservative voters, and actually different degrees of that, to help us really sort of understand what how conservative voters and potential conservative voters looked at climate and some of the aspects to that. It was a national survey. The data has been adjusted and weighted for regional and other demographic requirements. As I mentioned, we had a large number of questions. For the purpose of our event here today, I'm going to focus on 3 or 4 sort of key questions that I think will help start the conversation in terms of our panelists and those of you out there. The first question is really, how important is a credible climate policy electorally? This was a question, and I should say, I've been really pleased to have been working with Clean Prosperity for a number of years. This is a question that we've asked for a while in terms of understanding where this fits for the voter. And, to be honest, electorally, it's one of these issues that you need to have a space on. This has been very consistent in terms of the high 50s, low 60% of voters nationally are saying for them to consider voting for a federal political party, that party has to have a strong plan for addressing climate change. We asked some questions in terms of how the parties were perceived in their climate change plans in this election. Not surprising, the Conservative Party, doesn't compare well to some of the others. But there was some improvement in this election. But it's just it's almost in some of the business we call it like table stakes in terms of in order to be in this, to be part of this, as a competitive force in the election, you have to be, strong on climate. That number is consistent regionally, particularly consistent in some of those vote-rich provinces, Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, even in Alberta, where some would say that the climate issue is not viewed. It's over 40%, 44% of voters in Alberta are saying that they want a strong climate policy. If we move to the next sort of question that I wanted to provide some data on is, what is that strong, what makes up a credible climate change policy? So we've determined the fact that Canadians are looking for something. So what are the elements that go into that? And we tested in our exit poll 5,000 Canadians, a range of different elements that we asked whether or not these would be priority items in terms of making up a credible climate change plan. And we see, generally speaking, good consensus across the country. High in the mid to high 80s, mid 80s to the 80% in terms of a number of those policies on fee for polluters, technology, innovation, government support. But if we go down, even on the, and this is really going to be sort of the nub of, I'm sure, the conversation today, the notion of the carbon tax. 2/3 of voters in the country basically are saying that they feel a carbon tax and rebate that makes it more expensive to pollute, a price on carbon, should be included in a credible climate change policy. And quite frankly, even among certainly it's a little bit lower among conservative voters. But when we looked at that, I talked about sort of building out that threshold of those accessible conservative voters. We see that number, 66, 67% saying that a carbon tax should be part of a credible climate change policy. But we took that even further in terms of, what do Canadians think of a carbon tax specifically? We asked a very simple, straight up question. Do you support or oppose a carbon tax policy as a way to address climate change? So in terms of, and what I'm showing you on this slide is really the conservative voter, 42% say they support, a carbon tax. We got 49% opposed. So you do see that tussle, that internal tussle within the party. But if you take where the party has the potential to grow, you see that number now we've got 53, just over half. That reflects basically the national feeling on this, where you've got just over 50% support a carbon tax and this is without any sort of discussion around rebates or any sort of offsetting any other sort of offsetting measures. It's just straight up a carbon tax to address climate change. You see over 50% of the population. And again, when you think about sort of, those battleground provinces where the party wants desperately to increase its seat totals, Ontario and British Columbia, you see fairly, again, a majority support for carbon tax. But that simple question doesn't quite tell the whole story with respect to a carbon tax. If you put forward then the argument, do you support or oppose a carbon tax that either rebates, that's either the money collected is rebated back to families and businesses, or an alternative plan is to carbon tax that's offset with income tax reductions, you can take that just over 50% support, and now you're up to 60% support amongst voters in the country. And importantly, with that rebate or tax offsetting tax reductions, amongst conservative voters that we surveyed in our exit poll, over 50, all of a sudden now, with either a rebate or with a offsetting income tax reductions, amongst conservative voters, you move that number over 50%. With the income tax reductions, it goes just over 60%. So you can make that carbon tax more attractive to voters in general, and even more attractive to conservative voters. I know there's been lots of discussion in terms of certainly going into the campaign, in the lead up, and certainly with the Conservative Party shifting and its carbon pollution in terms of, would a carbon tax be a vote winner or loser for the party? As a lot of people suggested, well, if we adopt a carbon tax, we would lose more voters than we gain. We asked that question very deliberately to conservative voters in terms of how they would, accessible and current voters. And quite frankly, a carbon tax would not be a vote loser for the party based on our exit poll of 5,000 interviews. We asked if the Conservative Party adopted, and this was the version of the carbon tax that would be offset with income tax reductions. you can see that those that would be more likely to vote for the party outpace those who would be less likely to vote for the party, and a large plurality would be wouldn't change their support. In particular, when you look at that accessible voter, so those are voters that aren't voting for the Conservative Party at the moment, but they identified the Conservative Party as a potential second choice, or didn't rule them out as a party they would consider voting for. And obviously, in the last two elections, we're not happy with where we're at in terms of the party wouldn't be happy at in terms of where they're at electorally in respect to the number of votes. So I'm just going to finish off, Michael. I've just got a couple more slides, mindful of time here, that I want to. So, I mean, there's, obviously part of our discussion here will be why didn't the party, if the party moved in the right direction with respect to where voters felt they should go in terms of climate policy, they took that step with respect to a carbon tax. But why didn't Conservatives do better in the election, this last election we just had? I mean, there's a couple reasons that we're able to suss out in our poll. I think most importantly, and I'll show it on this slide, the climate change issue shifted in this election. In 2019, and certainly in some of the polling that we did right after the 2019 election, the climate issue was of much higher importance to Canadians. What happened in this election is that, and this was, some would have said it was one of our first post-pandemic elections. Ultimately, it still actually was a pandemic election, given the fourth wave in particular parts of the country. The pandemic shifted the issue matrix in this country, and certainly shifted the issue matrix amongst how voters perceived climate. It dropped down. It certainly didn't disappear, but noteworthy, it's ahead still of some of those core kind of a few core issues in terms of deficit reduction and sort of taxation. But it did drop behind, I would say, some of the more pandemic influenced issues, particularly economic recovery, some of the cost pressures households are facing, as directly, indirectly as a result of the pandemic. You certainly see these were aided categories that we presented, and these were, what I'm showing you here is these were picked as the top three priorities. So multiple mentions, in terms of what would be your top 1, 2, and 3 priorities. And as you can see here, climate's sort of in the middle of the pack, fourth in our list. It is fair to say that amongst Conservative voters, there's definitely a difference, compared to the voters in general. Conservative voters place a higher level on taxation and deficit reduction, but certainly among the accessible Conservative voters at lighter shade bar, the bottom of our 3, you see they're much more. They're still in lock with the voter pool at large. I would say that in our exit data, I don't have a slide to show this, but in our exit data, we also know that that awareness and knowledge of the Conservative Party's climate change policies and platform in this election was not that high. It was 50% or less on a lot of the elements. Again, in part because climate was not a predominant focus. Even when you look back at the 2019 debates versus the 2021 debates, the time spent on climate in these debates was less. And therefore, I think there was just less exposure to voters in terms of the party's different climate strategies. So, in essence, it just wasn't, the Conservatives, one might argue, made some right moves with respect to climate to appeal to a broader spectrum of voters. But the issue matrix didn't set up as well in this election. And the last point I'm going to make, because I suspect it's a question out there, we actually did a little bit of digging in terms of, did the Conservative Party's policy on climate fuel the rise of the People's Party of Canada and the Maverick Party in Alberta, Saskatchewan, in terms of pushing what were formerly Conservative voters, pushing them into those two parties. We asked a question of the People's Party of Canada and Maverick voters that we surveyed in our 5,000 person sample, and we actually had over over a couple hundred of those voters that we were able to get data from. And, not surprising based on sort of what was motivating, particularly the People's Party, but climate wasn't it. Climate was not a mention, was not a policy that was identified that drove those parties' voters. Those parties were largely, particularly for the People's Party, largely driven by the pandemic, by the stance on vaccine mandates, and just the whole notion of lockdowns and the perceived loss of freedoms. And so, that might be an important data point to keep in mind. And so, Michael, that takes me to the end of my, slides and what I wanted to share. So I'm in your hands at this point.
Wonderful. Let me just make sure that I can stop the share here. I think I can.
Perfect.
Good. Well, listen, that was great, Andrew. Really appreciate it. There's obviously a lot of rich data to mine, and we will be sharing. I saw some questions come into the Q&A. We will be sharing this whole video, including this presentation, and there will be more details on our website in the coming weeks on this poll. So Andrew will be back with us in a few minutes, but thank you, Andrew. For now, we're gonna mute you, and you will be back shortly. So now we're going to segue into the next part of our program, and I'm going to bring on the panelists for our panel here. So let me see if I can do that in order. So the first panelist is Lisa Raitt. Lisa is, hi Lisa. Lisa is many will know her, I'm sure, but she was elected as a Conservative MP back in 2008, and she went on to hold 3 senior portfolios. She was the Minister of Natural Resources, Labor, and Transport. And of course, most recently, she was the deputy leader of the Conservative Party when they were in opposition. Now, after leaving politics in 2019, Lisa has been with CIBC Capital Markets, and her focus right now is on senior client coverage and business development with clients in the energy, infrastructure, and industrial sectors, which obviously dovetails very closely with her expertise. So Lisa, it's good to have you here. Next, I'll introduce Ken Boessenkool. Ken is a longtime Conservative strategist who has played strategic and policy roles in 4 national election campaigns for the Conservative Party, all under the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's been the chief of staff to the Premier of British Columbia, a senior policy advisor to 3 national Conservative leaders, 2 Alberta finance ministers, and an Ontario Progressive Conservative leader. And he's also played senior policy and campaign roles in 3 national leadership campaigns and 3 provincial leadership campaigns. Lastly, he's a well-known academic. He's a professor at McGill, following a previous career as a founding partner of Cooltop and Guy Public Affairs. And finally, I will mention that Ken is the chair of our Volunteer Public Affairs Advisory Group at Clean Prosperity. And just as that sounds, it's a volunteer position, so he doesn't receive any compensation for that. Our next panelist is also on that Public Affairs Advisory Group, again, a volunteer group, and that's Mitch Davidson. Mitch is the Executive Director of the Strategy Core Institute of Public Policy and the Economy. Before that, he was the head of policy to Ontario Premier Doug Ford, and he has co-authored both recent Ontario PC platforms, including one that endorsed a revenue neutral carbon tax and one that opposed it. Mitch has sat on the task force for a resilient recovery, which was run by the Smart Prosperity Institute, and was looking at how to help the economy grow in the post-COVID recovery. And as I mentioned, he's part of our advisory group at Clean Prosperity. So welcome to everybody on the panel. It's really great to have you here, and we appreciate you making the time. Lisa, I'm going to start with you. So, when we had an event previously in April, you talked to us a bit about the Conservative Party's climate plan in the previous election in 2019, including about the fight against the carbon tax. And I recall you mentioning that, you thought that was actually part of what hurt your electoral chances in Milton in 2019. So now I want to fast forward to 2021, and I'm curious to see or to hear rather, how you would assess the Conservatives' climate policy in this election, both in terms of, do you think it was an important factor or not? And do you think it helped the party or not?
I think it leveled the playing field. I think it didn't become an issue at the door. And I did go out and knock doors, not in Milton, but I was in Brantford Brant and I was in Hamilton Ancaster. And in both cases, Not once. First of all, not a lot of doors open. This was a very bizarre campaign. Like, let's be honest, 1 in 10 doors opened up because of the pandemic. So it's not a beautiful set of data for me, but I can tell you it never came up with the doors. It was accepted the fact that every party had a climate plan, and each one of them would have an impact in a different way. But overall, we all agreed that emissions need to be reduced and that the world was moving towards a world where fossil fuels were not going to be utilized. And I would just point out, Stephen Harper first said that when we were in government in 2008 during that electoral time. The goal was that the world do transition from fossil fuels. And that is something that was conservative principle then and should still be a conservative principle now. Where we got cornered was on the fight over one specific thing on carbon pricing. And we won 2 elections on it. And now we've lost 2 elections with that as an issue. And I would just suggest that having the policy platform that we did, explain that there was a conservative way forward. You may not love it, but it is a conservative way forward that includes pricing. And as a result, I think it kind of wrestled itself to neutral, and other issues came up. And I'm glad to see the party is taking a serious look at what those other issues were that may have caused us to not perform as well in the GTA, the tight hub around the GTA as we did, because we picked up seats in Ontario that didn't go our way last time.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a great segue into my next question. And actually, I think you partially answered it, but I'll just see if you want to add on to it, because I was going to ask you that you do hear after the election folks saying, well, look, the strategy must not have worked. It's not only referring to climate, I think, but it's said about climate and carbon pricing as well, that did the strategy really work if the party didn't pick up more seats in some of those suburban areas? So is there anything else you'd want to add to respond to that?
I would just say that nobody knows the answer to that question. That's why you have to take a look at it. My observation and what I would submit to James Cumming as he does this review is take a look at the hard facts of what happened in Peterborough and what happened in Bay of Quinte, where we did pick up. Was it an issue? Look at Nova Scotia. We picked up seats in Nova Scotia that we didn't pick up before. And Nova Scotia, by the way, for anyone who is interested, the economy, the future economy in Nova Scotia is based around things that you would consider to be sustainable issues, using the ocean, using technology. This is what Nova Scotians are looking towards as part of their bigger picture economy. So having a potential government saying, okay, we get climate is important, and that's where we're going to put some energy and focus into, it ties into their economic messaging. So yeah, we picked up more seats in Nova Scotia.
Appreciate you mentioning the Atlantic Canadian situation. Without Louis here, it's good to have somebody representing that perspective. So yeah.
I am here today. I'm here at St. FX today, actually. My old alma mater. So
wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. And for anyone who joined us late, Louis Leger unfortunately is sick today, so couldn't join us, but he sends his regrets, and hopefully we'll have him next time. So Mitch, I'm going to go to you next. I mentioned in the opening that you were part of campaigns for the progressive conservatives in Ontario that have advocated for pricing, and ones that have advocated, of course, against it. And so I guess my question is really, I'd love you to talk about the perspective of those who are more skeptical of carbon pricing. And if you want, you could generalize that as well to just folks who are more skeptical about being too ambitious about climate policy. Maybe you could provide some insight into what that perspective would be.
Yeah, I think skepticism is probably a good word to use, because I would chalk it up to a few factors. I think naturally, if you're a conservative voter and you lean that way, hearing anything with the word tax in it scares you a little bit. I think that's always a gut reaction, a visceral one. And so obviously that the importance of a rebate or those sorts of things would help counter that. So that's the first, is there's just a natural opposition towards government taxation and growing the size of government. The second thing about it is once you get people beyond that barrier of, okay, government's not actually going to keep the money, it wants to give it back, which seems a bit counterintuitive. Once you get that on board, there's a real legitimate question, I think, about where does that money go? Who is going to receive those funds? Am I going to be better off or worse off as a result? And I think there's a very legitimate criticism of the current tax scheme. If you live in a rural part of the province or the country, a northern part, or even just frankly somewhere where you have to rely on a car to get to work or to live your life. And so those are a couple of the levels of skepticism about climate policy, I think, is about, is government going to keep the money or not? Can I actually trust them? And then do I trust them to give it back to me individually instead of to other people who might benefit from it? The one other thing that I would point out here is I do think that conservatives have struggled a bit from putting a climate change plan and an environmental plan as the same thing. I think there really needs to be a differentiation. It's important to do things like protect parkland and wildlife and those things that are more sort of natural environment that we come to talk about. That has to be a part of the plan, but it is not a replacement for things that are against climate change and actually reducing emissions. I think those are two separate policy areas that we need to make sure that we have two separate plans addressing. We can't just look at one that's very conclusive on protecting lakes and rivers and those sorts of things and say that that's enough for the other side of the equation. It really does require two different policy instruments. And so I think those are some of the trends and criticisms that I commonly come across in the policy area when it relates to climate change and the environment.
Great. And you had a piece you did earlier this year, I think it was, in Policy Options, where you laid out a little bit of the potential thinking and options really for the party as it pertains to climate policy. Ultimately in that article, I think you came down for pricing, but you did lay out a bunch of other options too. So maybe you could just kind of briefly go over that. Like, why in the end did you feel pricing was the right policy? But also, if you could, maybe give a little bit of mention of some of the other options, because I think we're going to talk and have talked today a lot about pricing as one part of a plan, but I do think it's important to recognize that it isn't, as I said in the opening, not just about one policy, right? It's really about making progress on this issue. So love to hear from you a little bit about summarizing that piece. Yeah,
and I think that's the first point, is there are other ways to get to net zero by 2050 or to try to tackle climate change. I think it would be a disservice if we didn't explore them in some capacity. But I think what I argued in the op-ed and what I think more generally is that each of these ideas, be it things like I talked about an accelerated depreciation for businesses that make pro-climate investments, so invest in new technology that would help reduce their emissions output, or talked about individual negotiations with provinces that didn't want to take part in a carbon tax about ways that they could do different policies to reduce emissions. But what you find when you explore each of these and you sort of peel back the onion is they're either more expensive, they're more interventionist from a government perspective, they require larger government, more bureaucracy, more administration, or they really do intrude into the lives of businesses and people. So these other ideas, they exist, and there is a way to sort of stitch together a quilt or a fabric of policies that will get you there, but they'll cost you more, and they will be a sort of a hallmark of larger government with more intervention and more rules and red tape, which are things that, generally speaking, I like to believe that the Conservative Party and the Conservative movement are against. And so when I went through sort of all those different options, you end up with the logical one, which is a revenue neutral price on carbon, is the least interventionist by government, the least expensive for taxpayers, and ultimately delivers the best results. Great, thanks, Mitch. Ken, let's bring you into the conversation, and let's start by addressing something that I think is probably on a lot of people's mind, which is Western Canada perspective. The party lost some support in Western Canada, still gained most of the seats. And I know you've dug into this data, including some of the data that we had in our recent exit poll. And I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about what you think the data reveals to you about how the climate policy O'Toole put forward in the last election fared and what that says about the future.
Yeah, I think Andrew touched on a couple of these things, and I think there is definitely a lower level of support for carbon pricing, carbon taxes in Alberta than there is in the other parts of the country. Although in BC, of course, the support in BC is as high as it is in Quebec. So if that's a place where you have to concentrate on, we have to go there. But when you dig down, when you look at things like how do you use the money, we keep coming back to this. I think fundamentally, if the Conservatives say our climate plan will not cost taxpayers a penny more than what they're paying now, that we will put a price on carbon, but we will make sure that we rebate every single penny of those dollars back to Canadians. And you see this big jump in support, even in Alberta, and even among people who went and voted for the PPC. You see this. The People's Party, you see this jump in support if they know that the money is not being used to spend on other programs and or to make government bigger. And I think that's how we get back to the sort of core Conservative principles, is we say we're going to put a price on carbon and we're going to make sure that no one pays anymore. I think, just to speak quickly about Erin O'Toole, I think Erin O'Toole tried to talk about that by saying every penny you pay in carbon price, we're going to give you back a card or some kind of rebate. And maybe that was too complicated. I don't want to get into details, but I think my core point is I think he tried to get across that your cost of living wouldn't go up. When we saw in the Andrews polling, cost of living, inflation, housing, that's a huge concern. And we just have to make sure that whatever we do on carbon pricing doesn't cost people more. And maybe what we should also think about is if the Liberal plan is taking a few of their dollars and making government bigger, and they're not rebating all the money back, or they're unfair to rural Canadians, or they're unfair to suburban Canadians, that we point that out, that we say a conservative carbon price will not increase your cost of living, and maybe point out a couple of areas where the Liberal plan does exactly that.
Great. So let me push a little further on this topic, just because I think it's probably on people's minds, which is that, even though I think both you and Mitch and Lisa too have talked about some of the merits of pricing as a policy, what would you say to people who say, look, that may all be true, but in the end, this is creating disunity within the party. This is creating friction that's not necessary. So do we really need this? Shouldn't we just give up this fight and just go a different way on climate? What do you say to that argument?
I think if we said we know we have to have carbon pricing as part of our plan, and we're going to make that a central part of our climate plan, but that also means we don't have to do all of this expensive stuff that the Liberals are doing. And they're spending $40 billion over the next 10 years on a whole bunch of initiatives that if you have a carbon tax that you believe in, we don't need to spend that money. So we not only can take the carbon tax revenues and cut taxes with it, but we can take all that $40 billion, stop spending that money, and either make government smaller or cut people's taxes. So I think there's a huge opportunity to get back to some conservative messaging, be more critical of what the Liberals are doing, because the Liberals are having, they've got a carbon tax and they're spending all this money and they're regulating the economy. It's like they're triple whammy that they're hurting the economy. We've been unable to be critical of what the Liberals are doing because we've been so hung up on this carbon pricing. So let's say we've now crossed the Rubicon as far as I'm concerned on carbon pricing. Let's say we're going to do carbon pricing, but then we're going to undo all that additional Liberal regulation, and we're going to undo all that Liberal spending, and we're going to use that for tax cuts and freeing up the economy. And I think that's a winning conservative message that gets back to some of our core conservative ideals.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, well, look, Lisa, I'm going to turn back to you, and I saw you now.
I want to weigh in.
I was just going to say, I was going to let you weigh in, and then I'll ask you the question. Please go ahead.
Because I'm with Ken completely on this, and I would implore fellow conservatives who are tied up in knots on this issues with this notion, which is the world is moving on in terms of transition. And the world's economies are moving on in terms of transition. There's no question about it. That's exactly where we're going, and we can't stop it. And unless we have a conservative voice in decision-making places, we're going to lose our natural gas industry, and we're going to blow it on our opportunities in critical minerals. And that's why I care. I know that we win on local pocketbook issues, elections, but guys, we have to win, because the amount of damage that the Liberals could possibly wreak on that amount of prosperity for our country really does give me great concern. So I'm not saying abandon our principles in order to win. What I'm saying is I'm inviting you to look at the bigger picture, that if you accept the fact that we are moving towards more electrification, that we are moving towards less carbon intensity when we produce and process minerals, listen, we've got to be there and be part of it, or we're going to be left in the back and not going to have an economy that we can pass to our kids. And we have it. We're number 5 in the world in nickel, for God's sake. We're number 5 in the world in nickel. And we take 17 years to give a permit to a mine. Only conservatives are going to be able to figure out the regulatory overburden on that stuff. The Liberals aren't going to do it.
Thanks, Lisa. And that actually segues into the question I was going to ask you. So I'll just see if you want to add on, which is kind of putting on your hat as in your role at CIBC and talking to, I'm sure, lots of investors and potential projects. When you think about what they're looking for, and you think about trying to attract more investment dollars into Canada, what does that tell you? Like, what would you want people to know about that need in terms of what it means for policy that we ought to have?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you flat out that I believe that investors and companies in this country are concerned that there is no policy coherence at the federal level when it comes to natural gas production and utilization, or with respect to critical minerals and mining. And as a result, we're going to be, left behind unless there's some kind of coherence on the federal level of what direction we want to go in. it's going to be really difficult for Canada. And I'm very passionate about it. These conversations are live. They're happening at the table, and companies are making investment decisions now that are for the next 5 years, and there's no certainty for them in what's going on. And yet we're going to be fighting about what a carbon tax looks like. And I would just say, honest to gosh, take a page from the Liberals' books. In some cases, they hated our childcare benefit, but boy, they adopted it, doubled down on it pretty quickly, and won a couple of elections off of it, didn't they?
Mitch, to bring you back in, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this, and Ken referenced this earlier, but the specific policy design here of the pricing plan that Erin O'Toole and the party went out with in the last election, which, just for folks' benefit on the call, was to have a price that went up to $50 a ton, but then to keep the money that any individual paid in a account for that individual. So they kept their money, but it was in an account that was kind of regulated and only allowed to be spent on low carbon activities. So just love your, as a policy person, love to hear your reflections on that policy.
Yeah, so I'll say two things. The first is to give credit where it's due, right? So to Ken's point about crossing the Rubicon, like it was a courageous decision to endorse the policy and a big one to get there. And so I think any answer about the design of the policy needs to start by recognizing that they took a leap and the right one in our minds, but ultimately that needs to be said. So the second thing I think is when it comes to carbon taxes, explaining it to voters, there's a real tendency in sort of environmental policy to speak in a language that is not accessible, right? We talk about retrofits and all sorts of different language with emissions and tons reduction and so on and so on and so on. And the average person wants to understand, is my gas price going up? Will it be more expensive to buy a car? Will it be more expensive to get to work? So on and so on and so on. These are the things that you need to talk about. You need to talk about in the benefit that relates to them. And so where I think that the party fell a bit short in the election was describing what the benefit would be, what those types of things were that you could buy, how much you were going to be able to get into your account, what that meant for your day-to-day life. So is it actually going to be easier to take your kids on a vacation or to buy a new car, or whatever these things might have been as a result of the benefit? The point is I think you needed to talk a bit more about the actual applicability to individuals, what they were going to be able to afford, the things that they could buy, what that was going to look like for them. So I do think that there's an easier policy administratively in terms of a tax cut or a straight rebate. But if you want to go with something that reduces emissions once you actually get the money back in your pocket as well, you can do that. I think you just really need to hammer home why it's beneficial for people and what they get out of it. When you do that in a bit more clear language, I think it'll be that much more of an attractive idea.
Great, thanks for that. Ken, I'm curious, we've talked in the past, and I think maybe you even referenced it earlier, or maybe it was Mitch perhaps, that talked about, how the current Liberal policies, perhaps, how there's geographic impacts. There's different impacts on rural areas versus urban areas. And I know you've talked about trying to flip the script on that. And I'd just love to hear you talk for a few minutes about how you see the kind of urban, suburban, rural divide playing into the climate policy space.
Yeah, I mean, I got some data on how the Liberal carbon tax and rebate affects people in different parts of the country. And it was kind of interesting because and I went right down to how people vote. And it turned out the Liberals were giving the biggest rebates to people that vote NDP and Green to try to convince them to come over to their side. And they gave the smallest rebates to sort of suburban and rural conservative voters. And so I think there's things conservatives can do to fix that and say, we're going to make this fairer for suburban families and we're going to make this fairer for rural Canadians. Look, the Liberals will throw big taxes and big government at the climate. I think conservatives have to say, under our plan, you won't pay a penny more. And we're not going to throw big government. Government's not going to get bigger and your wallet's not going to get smaller. And that's how we're going to attach climate. We're going to put a price on carbon and give every penny back. We have a model for this. There was the name of his party is Liberal, but he was a conservative premier in British Columbia. He ran on this. He literally put it as the front and center of his thing. We are going to put a price on carbon and we're going to give massive tax cuts back to British Columbians. And it not only happened, it stuck. And it's very popular in BC. And I think if we look at that model and we find ways to say we're going to undo the big government approach to the Liberals, the big regulatory approach to the Liberals, we're going to tax carbon and give every penny back, I think that's a winning message for conservatives.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going to go to, yeah, please go ahead, Mitch.
I was just going to jump in there quickly and say from a party perspective, right? I think this urban-rural cleavage is one of the sort of predominant trends that's happening in this country. And right now we are returning rural conservatives hand over fist, which is great. And we need to do more than just that. But rightfully so, these individuals in caucus are going to Ottawa. The people that from their constituencies are ones knocking on doors. They're the ones donating to the party. They're the ones going to conventions. If you have a policy that discriminates against rural individuals or treats them unfairly, you're going to continue to hear about this for a long time. And so, and I think that's just a fact of the matter of the constituencies that the Conservative Party traditionally represents. So not fixing this policy that disproportionately impacts or benefits, rather is the word, disproportionately benefits people who live in downtown Toronto and can walk or take a bike to work, and negatively impacts those who have to, drive to childcare or to groceries. You really need to fix that imbalance, and the Conservative Party can do that by making some simple tweaks in the ways that the rebates are adjusted on a revenue neutral carbon price. So just something that I think we're going to keep having this conversation time and time again, rightfully so, if it's not addressed. So something the party will have to do.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience now. And the first question is going to be from former MP Bob Sopak. Hi, Bob. Good to have you here. So Bob asked this. He says, how will public opinion change regarding carbon taxes if the current spike in food and fuel prices, which disproportionately affects low-income people, rural residents, and possibly our food security due to fertilizer price increases, is linked to current climate change policies and carbon taxes? So in other words, how does, and one of you mentioned this earlier, how does the cost of living pressures affect this conversation around climate? Does anyone want to take that?
I do.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I will start off. I'm not going to take it because Bob, you and I are on the same track here. What I'm concerned about in this Ontario upcoming provincial election is that there's going to be a crossover on issues between carbon pricing and the cost of electricity and the cost of natural gas to heat your home. And there is going to be a big surprise for people when they start opening up their natural gas bills this winter, because it's going to be a lot more expensive than they were before. And we're going to see a lot of energy poverty happening again. And that is a big issue. It's one thing to run federally on carbon price versus no carbon price, but on the provincial hustings, I mean, the reality is that that's where the costs truly do hit. And provincial candidates are going to have to do a bit of a two-step in terms of ensuring that they can separate the two if they possibly can. And how are they going to deal with the fact that, well, one of the repercussions of what's happening in our economy right now is that things are going to be more expensive, and the carbon tax is going to be part of that costing as well. And how is the government going to help these folks in the long term? And that's going to be, I think, a really live issue as we roll through March and February of next year.
Yeah. Mitch, Ken, did you want to add anything to that?
I'm just going to quickly say that, Premier Doug Ford has wisely decided to adopt the industrial carbon pricing scheme that the federal government has and take that revenue into the province. And I think he should also take the retail side carbon pricing that is in Ontario, and then use those revenues to help exactly the people you're talking about. For him to continue to let Justin Trudeau collect that revenue and decide how to buy off his voter coalition instead of taking that money into provincial coffers and deciding how to help the people that are going to be affected by rising prices, I think it's just it's an obvious decision to make, and that those taxes are there. And he's given up on that revenue. And I don't understand why he doesn't just say, we're going to take that revenue into provincial coffers and we're going to help people with cost of living pressures, the kind of thing Mitch talked about. And I think the kind of things Lisa was just talking about.
Great. Mitch, anything you wanted to share there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I'd say to Ken's point is from the polling there, with affordability being sort of the key issue, a carbon tax can be an affordability measure, right? If you are taking actions that reduce your emissions, if you are driving less, you're doing those things, you are going to have a net increase yourself. If you obviously, you drive a Hummer and you do all those things, like perhaps it's not going to be the most beneficial for you, but the reality is the government can target some of this relief to people who most truly need it in a way that has the most benefit. So if we are talking about increasing in home prices or increasing food prices or whatever it might be, what better way to address those things than having money back in my pocket from a tax cut? So that's kind of where I come at that. But I do take Lisa's point that it will be difficult for people to reconcile the difference between what is actually in your food bill and what isn't, and where those costs come from. It certainly will be a communications challenge.
You know, a couple of you referenced in your answers the provincial situations and the fact that there's going to be elections coming up in the provinces. And it's actually another question I wanted to ask you. So maybe I'll do that now, which is we're going to have a series of pretty consequential provincial elections over the next couple of years. We've got Ontario and Quebec next year. We've got Alberta the year after, and Manitoba is not far behind either. So how do you see the conversation provincially impacting perhaps where the federal party might go on climate policy, if at all, or does it not matter in your view? Maybe we'll just do another go around the same way. So Lisa, if I could start with you, what are your thoughts on that?
You know, Doug Ford won his majority, a significant majority, and he promised that he would kill the carbon tax. And I heard him 10 days ago say he hates the carbon tax, and I believe him, and Ontarians believe him as well. And that's completely different, you would think, from what we were saying on the federal level, which is we do believe there should be a price on carbon. The communications around this is going to be interesting, and I'm not even going to try to give advice on it. You know, I think I just would say that a provincial voter seems to be different than a federal voter, and a lot of it has to do with the ability of the leader to communicate their position and what it means to Ontarians. But this election in Ontario is going to be about affordability after the winter I think we're going to go through.
Great. Ken?
I echo what Lisa said. I think it's going to be a challenge. I would just commend Premier Ford for taking 40% of emissions in Ontario and applying the carbon price to it and taking those revenues into the provincial coffers. And Jason Kenney's done the same in Alberta with the industrial carbon price. So 70% of emissions in Alberta are being taxed by Jason Kenney and being brought into provincial coffers. A lot of the money that's being brought into provincial coffers by the industrial carbon price is being used on sort of different kinds of industrial policy. And I would urge these governments to think about redirecting some of the proceeds of that industrial carbon price into addressing some of these cost of living pressures, as opposed to doing industrial or climate policy, expensive big government climate policy. And I think there is some room to do that. So I think, again, this is kind of the wonky side of things, but there's a lot of revenue coming into Ontario and Alberta from this industrial carbon price. And I think we should take a look at what we're using those revenues for and making sure that those revenues are going to address the concerns of prices going up because of the things Lisa talked about earlier.
Great. Mitch?
Yes. So the point that I would make, I take it in a bit of a different direction. I think if you're going to be a provincial party that opposes carbon taxes, I think you got to be genuine about it. And to Lisa's point, I think Doug Ford is there. I don't think there's any misgivings or secret agenda when he stands up and says that he doesn't support a carbon tax. I believe him when he says it. I used to work for the man. I know that it's true. That said, I think, when we're approaching this election, you got to remember that this is still going to be recovery from a pandemic election. Things that Lisa said about increasing in prices and affordability also relates to the fact that people are not necessarily comfortable in their jobs. They're not necessarily making as much income as they were previously. And I think there's something to be said about a government that if you're not going to be supportive of a price on carbon as a way to fight climate change, okay, but you've got to have something else on climate change and on environment. And to me, there's a way to marry that idea of economic prosperity and growth with pro-environmental things. And we're seeing the Ford government's already doing this in a way with endorsements of electric vehicle production in the GTA, but things like Lisa said earlier, mining in the north. We're talking about areas of a province, and I'm sure it's similar in other provinces that I don't study as well, but areas of the province that are having 9% unemployment still, higher than much higher than Kathleen Wynne or Dalton McGuinty era administrations, right? So we're talking about some pretty serious economic challenges that need to be reversed. And one way that you can reverse those challenges is by, sort of jumping in with both feet to the future economy in some way. And so I do think that if we're going to be opposed to the number one thing we can do to reduce emissions, let's not also be opposed to the number two thing we can do to reduce emissions and protect the economy at the same time.
Okay, great. Okay, we're going to see if we can sneak in 2 last questions. We're getting close to time, but the next one, I'm going to take another question from the audience. This one comes from Bill Armstrong. He's asking, has anyone considered the communications failures around the carbon tax? And he says there's 2 issues. No one from government seemed capable of explaining the rebates with examples, and there was no information available on where dollars went to whom and for what. And that this vacuum was filled with kind of a Loblaws getting rich, or if you give it all back, what's the point? So I guess Bill's really commenting on the strategy of the Liberals in a sense of how they supported it, and maybe that's why there isn't more support among the public, I'm going to assume. Do any of you want to comment on that?
I think your rebate policy and your tax cut policy has to be clear. I mean, my good friend Stephen Harper used to say to me that the 2004 election platform for the Conservatives was a beautiful conservative document. But the thing is, we didn't win, and it had all kinds of fancy tax cuts and fancy stuff. And then in the next election, we decided we're going to cut the GST, and that was easy to explain and easily understood. And so as much as me with my economist hat on would like to design all the rebates to be very fancy for all these right people, maybe increasing carbon pricing and a big cut to the GST to make it very simple to explain and simple to show, maybe that is the compromise between winning elections and the right thing to do economically. So, we've got some very smart people around Erin O'Toole doing policy and doing strategy, and some very good friends of mine, and I think they're well smart enough to figure some of this out. We've got we've got a couple of provincial elections, as you say. I think the key ones in Alberta and Ontario, and I'm hopeful that they can sort some of this stuff out as well. And just to speak specifically to the question, I think it's true that Canadians don't understand they're getting rebates and connect that back to the carbon price. And I think Conservatives can do a better job of that, and they should do it by saying not one penny that you spend on carbon prices will you not get back in the form of some other tax cut or rebate. And the Liberals have focused on the climate change side of it. We should focus on the tax cut side of it. And I think that's a winning communications strategy for us.
Great. Okay, final question, and we just have about 2 minutes left. I'm just going to ask each of you if there's any if you had to give one piece of advice to Erin O'Toole, if you were sitting with him, or will maybe be sitting with him tomorrow, and you've all given a lot of helpful ideas, so you can feel free to highlight one you've already mentioned, but what would be the one thing you'd want to leave with him to say, this is what you really ought to do or think about when it comes to climate policy? Does anyone want to volunteer to go first on that? I see Ken unmuting, so it looks like maybe you're ready.
Yeah, look, I think we've taken an enormous step forward. So I would just say, let's stay committed to having a credible climate change policy, number one. And number two, let's make sure that Canadians aren't paying any more. And then particularly that applies to suburban families and rural Canadians.
Terrific. Mitch, I'm gonna go next, and then I'll give Lisa the final word.
Yeah, so I would say some of what Ken said with a slight adjustment, which is, keep on the path that you're on, but I would really emphasize do something for your rural constituents, because it will go a long way to giving your caucus something to talk about at the hustings, to talk about when people are opposed to the policy, and ultimately to make sure that you have support in the interim between the times where you need to go to that CPC accessible voter, because the reality is you've got quite a few million CPC voters who put you into the place you are now. So you best appease them at the same time that you attract others. So my advice would be similar path, fix that rural side of things, and you'll find yourself with a lot more support.
Great. And Lisa?
Yeah, I would say he should continue on the path that he's taken, which is to take a look at the bigger picture, long-term growth and economic prosperity that comes when you embrace the technology and the opportunities around the transition that we are going through. We should not always focus on the bad. We should focus on the opportunity. And I take a page from what Doug Ford is doing in his government. And he is doing great work around EV. He recognizes the importance of talking up our auto manufacturing sector in Ontario. And, it may seem not to be climate policy, but it is climate policy. It's the next step in climate policy.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Well, look, thanks so much. We're going to have to wrap up now, but I just want to thank our panel. I want to thank Andrew Enns for a great conversation. You know, Clean Prosperity will continue to organize events like this because ultimately we believe that we want to have the Conservative Party at the table, engaging constructively with conservative ideas about how to move forward on the climate file. So please reach out to us after this if you have any questions or feedback. And we look forward to seeing you all again at another event soon. All right, have a good day, everybody.